Right. So we've done quite a lot with the portraits recently, and we're going to sort of move forward a little bit. We're going to be looking at a couple of techniques using the acrylics and things, just to sort of, if you haven't used them before, just to give you a little bit of a basic idea about how you're going to use them, and then how you might use them on a portrait as well. And there's a technique that we're going to have a look at too, which is kind of like doing an underpainting for then adding colour on top of to get the skin tones and things like that. And it's called Grisaille or Grisaille technique. And it's quite an old technique where you use very limited colours or mono colours or even just greys to create the tones and shadows underneath the skin colour, and that helps you sort of map out the shapes, so the shapes and the form of the face. So it's very much like what we've already been doing with the charcoal and with the inks, and it just means that you've mapped out those tones and shadows so that then you can start to layer very thinly, if you like, the skin tones on top. So we will look at the skin colours, sorry, next week. But this week we're going to have a look at this Grisaille technique. So I started one of those last night, but we'll have a quick look in the little gallery thing I've got over here. So I started painting this lovely chap last night. And I've put on a number of photographs for you to have a look at on the website. I've also put these pictures on there, and this one here, which is an acrylic technique sheet. I've got two of those which I put on the website for you to see. But it just gives you an idea of the flexibility of acrylic paints. You can do a lot with these paints. I suppose the only thing that some people sometimes complain about is the fact that they dry really, really quickly. But saying that, you can use different mediums to keep them wet. And indeed, I've also bought a set of paints which are a little bit more expensive, but they stay wetter for about 70% longer than the normal acrylic paints, which I'm going to be using the normal acrylic paints today anyway. And as we were talking about a few minutes ago, regarding keeping quantities of paint wet, there's different things you can do for that as well, by storing them in certain ways. But anyway, these are some of the techniques on this sheet that you can try out, which shows you the flexibility of acrylic paint. So it says dry brush here, but it shows that, you know, blending's quite nice to do. We've got pointillism, which is doing stippling. You can use a sponge to create the textures. You can use watery drips as well and let the paint run. You can almost use them a lot like watercolors as well, because you can water them down and make them quite transparent so that you can get multiple layers of colors, and when those layers go on top of each other, those colors mix up. And then there's different mediums you can use, which I'll introduce a little bit later on, where you use impasto technique. So impasto is an Italian word, which basically means that you can create texture with the paint. So you can basically thicken it right up and use a palette knife or create different textured surfaces like the ones you can see on this sheet here. So we'll have a look at some of those things as we go on. But what I'll be doing in just a second is showing you how to do a basic blend with the paints, and then maybe using and how to create a nice flat background to work on. Okay, so just put that over there like that, and then put that down there. So this picture here of this lady just sort of illustrates what we're going to be doing or looking at today. So you can see the undercoat. It does have the black and white area. It does actually have a little bit of colour, and we're going to use colours to create these greys today, and I'll show you the different colours that I'm going to use and the ones that I've already used. But you can see how it's an underpainting, because here you can see the artist is laying over some skin tones on top of the grey areas to create the skin colour. And just up on the top there, you can also see how there's a little bit of brown and things in there coming in for the hair and stuff. But you know, as you can see, the paint, even on the background there, just near the artist's hand in the brown bit, you can see how the brush can be, the paint can be applied over dark areas to create this kind of scumbled, textured effect, which is, you know, it's not too disruptive to the rest of the picture, but it creates a little bit of interest as well in the background without distracting from the portrait. The second picture I've got, I'll just get rid of that one, and we'll get that one. Here's this one, just here. So this one shows you pretty much the whole process of doing this technique. So you can see that the textures, or the tones and shadows, have been applied quite loosely, if you like, over the background, and it really maps out over the face, and it really maps out the features and the tones and shadows and brings it out in a sort of 3D way. And then gradually this artist has applied the color in small areas, building layers of tone of highlights on top, as well as tones and textures, which you can use. I think this was done in acrylic, I'm not sure, but it's a great example of how this technique can work. So you can see the last three stages, and then finally this really beautiful detail and texturing on the top, which we'll also have a little look at as we work.
Jamie, just a quick question.
Yeah.
So we do the pencil first, and then do we do the different black and white shades? Would that be with acrylic as well, or would that be with ink like we've been doing?
No, we're going to use acrylic to do all the shades.
All the time.
Yeah, we're going to use acrylic to do all the shades. You'll need to draw it out in pencil first.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll have a look. I'll tell you about that in a second.
Brilliant, so thank you.
Great, that's all right. So we'll go over to my little desk just here. So one of the first things you want to do when you come to do your painting is apply a flat area of colour to work over the top of. You don't want anything too dark necessarily, because what you want to do is make the whites come out, but also be able to paint in the dark colours or the dark shadows. So a mid sort of neutral sort of colour behind your portrait will be really useful. So I've got a little example here of an eye that I was working on last night. So if you haven't used acrylics and you think, oh, I'd like to have a little bit of practice with these just to sort of get back into the spirit of things, bearing in mind we've done watercolours a lot recently, then the thing to do is to try like a feature, like an eye or a nose. All I've done here is I've just used one of my previous drawings that I did in one of the last classes. I think it was with us actually. So I've just, I've got a drawing here, and I've applied a wash or a flat area of colour over the top, and that was with this yellow ochre just here. I'll go through all the colours again in a minute. I might even get to write them on the screen here for you. So you're going to want a plate. As far as brushes go, I've got these brushes here, which don't actually cost very much at all. I think I brought about 50 of these varied brushes on Amazon for about £10. I think they're a little bit more now, depends on when you go on Amazon. But it's got the whole range. It's got really small brushes to these nice flat brushes here. So a flat brush like this is really good for creating the flat background that we're looking at. Filbert brushes can also do the same sort of thing. And basically a filbert brush like this big one I've got here it's a bit like a flat brush in that you can, I'll just come in a bit closer. it's a bit like a flat brush in that it's this sort of shape, but it's got a rounded end, and it's a lot more flexible for doing a variety of things, whereas this brush is quite good for doing the flat areas of colour. I did actually use this filbert brush to create the backgrounds on here. All right, so I'll do a basic sort of blend first of all. I'm going to use burnt umber for that. So this is something, if you've not done acrylics before, you might want to have a go at doing a few of these basic blends. So we've got white and I've got this burnt umber, and I'm going to do a blend over the top of this. I've got that little bit of room there. Okay, a smaller brush. I use this filbert brush and get some water just to loosen the paint up a little bit. And let's just shift this over so you can see. There we go. There we are. Right, okay, so thing to do is first of all get a bit of your paint. Now, as I said earlier, the paint does dry really quickly, which means that if you add a little bit more water, you can keep it wet for slightly longer. And then what you do when you've done the pure colour, so I've used the burnt umber there, just going to add a little bit of white to the paint, and then underneath where I just painted, I start to put the colour, the tint, and then I go back over it like that, and you've got a nice blend. And then I add a little bit more, just a bit further over, add a bit more water so it doesn't get too thick and dry too fast. As soon as it touches the paper, really, it starts to dry quite quickly because it's a very thin layer. Sometimes often I'm taking excess paint off my brush, so there's not too much brush when I go to blend it. Not too much paint when I go to blend it, sorry. And then a bit more white again. And just work slightly away from where I just had my paint. And go back over. Take excess paint off. And we've got a nice blend like that. Okay, so that's how to do a blend with your acrylic paint. So I really recommend having a little play around and doing that. Now, when it comes to applying the paint to a subject, you're doing a similar sort of thing, a bit like up here. But we are using Grisaille technique today. So I am using, I'll let you know what the colours are now. So I have got a limited colour palette of these ones. Now, yellow ochre is what I used in the background to create this surface. But then I've got white, raw umber, burnt umber and ultramarine. Really, you can choose between these two just here. You don't need both colours. Raw umber's quite good because it really darkens the colour down quite a lot. Just switch my blind up a little bit. There we go. So these are the only colours you need, so it's quite limited. Ultramarine, when you mix it with burnt umber or raw umber, is going to make the equivalent of like a nice black sort of colour. Which you'll see when I show you the painting that I was working on last night. And then your tints and your highlights, when you add white to the mixture of these two, you'll find it goes very grey, which is how you get that kind of grey Grisaille effect. So let's just do that now. So I've got some burnt umber on here, and I've put some ultramarine on the plate. And I'm going to go for a smaller brush. So this is a really tiny filbert brush just here. So I'm going to mix those two together in equal parts. And you'll see how dark that has gone. In fact, on your screen, it probably looks pretty black from where you are. Okay, so I'll just paint in the iris on this one. So obviously this is just more of a flat sort of area of colour on here. Putting that one in, and then I'll do a little bit of a blend on the eye. So remember, this isn't a finished piece of work at this stage, it's an undercoat for what comes later, which will be a bit more colour and things. So I'm going to put in some white on the eye around here, and then I can grab a little bit of my black sort of deep brown colour, and I can start blending those areas straight away. So let's get in a bit closer there so you can just see that. Let's get it, make sure it's focused. There we go, that's about as good as I can get it, I think. There we go. So while it's wet, and I recommend working on smaller areas of colour to begin with, rather than when you come to do your portrait working on really large areas, because you'll find that it perhaps gets a bit confusing with larger areas of tone and shadow. So work on smaller areas to begin with and build out from there, a little bit like that picture that I showed you just a few minutes ago, and that will allow you to sort of play around with the paint and see the results of what it can do as you're working. You'll see that as I'm mixing the colour, I'm just taking a little bit of excess colour off of my brush by just putting it on this J cloth here, just so that I can reduce the amount of paint on the brush so that I can move it around while it's still wet. There, so I've added a little bit of shadow just underneath here. That shadow would continue across the eye over here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put a little bit of this burnt umber on the eye, like this, as a starting point. Don't forget to add just a little bit of water when you're working on smaller details, because you'll find the paint as it dries, it kind of goes a bit dry, and you don't get like nice smooth brush strokes. You get these I keep wanting to call hairy brush strokes, or dry brushing, which is another technique you can actually use for adding texture. So I've added a little bit of colour on there. Now I'm going to add a bit of tone, because often around the iris it's a little bit darker, so I'm going to add some tone around here. Now the other thing to watch out for, if you've got your brush with lots of water on it and the paint that you've already put on the surface is wet, if you put water on a damp surface of acrylic, you'll find it lifts the paint off. So the thing to do is make sure that your brush isn't too wet on damp on a damp area of paint. There we go. So that's the idea of today. Now I'm just going to put in a couple of highlights in there, because the highlights are quite good because they bring things to life a little bit. So I'm just using a bit of pure white in there, like that, and then I'm going to add a highlight on the top of the eye. as well. So if you've not used acrylics before, or if you're thinking, oh, I can't, you know, I'm a bit kind of rusty with this, then have a go at doing something like an eye on one of your old drawings today. So I'm going to show you how to do a flat area of colour next as a backdrop for working over. So this is one I did yesterday, so I'm going to zoom out again. There we go. So
Jamie, we need to do the background before the pencil work.
right, that's a good point. This where is it? This one I used an old drawing and I brushed over the top and it was absolutely no problem. Okay, and the one that I've just been working on, which I'll show you in a few minutes, I did the backdrop and then I drew on top. So to be honest with you, it doesn't make any difference. The difference is, I would say, that if you're drawing on top of a background, then and you're drawing away, obviously you're more likely to smudge the drawing with your hand, but you can still rub it out and things as normal. So it doesn't really make too much difference, if I'm honest with you. But that was a question that came up before too. So a little bit of yellow ochre and my large filbert brush is what I'm going to use. Dip it in the water a little bit. So not too much water. So you don't want to make it too wet, but you want to have it loose enough that you can see it's going to cover the area you want to. Of course, we're just using yellow ochre, so you can always just get a little bit more out. So that's quite loose, but it's not drippy, you know, it's not transparent. It's still got quite a lot of paint in there too. So when you do this, brush across first of all, and you'll find if you keep brushing it while it's wet and then while it gets damp, as opposed to soaking wet, you'll find that the streakiness starts to kind of disappear a little bit if you keep working it. So I've gone one way like that, and then I get the paint again and I go back the other way, and you'll still get streakiness. It doesn't actually matter too much with this because you are going to paint over it anyway. The nice thing about having an undercoat is that when you paint on top, you can see all of the highlights and the shadows. So as opposed to having a white background and putting white on a white background, you're putting white on a nice yellow ochre in this case. So you can see where you've painted white. So there we go. So that makes a lovely surface to get you started with your picture. Okay, so that's that. Now you might remember,
Jamie?
yeah.
Two things. One, watercolour tends to dry lighter, doesn't it? And acrylic can dry a bit darker, can't it?
Yeah, it can do. Yeah, it does change a little bit, but for the background on this, it's not really going to matter too much, I don't think.
What I'll be painting on is an acrylic board, but it's one that's already been painted over in white. I think there was something else on it, and it's been covered over.
Yeah.
Would I still need to paint another colour on it?
Yeah, I would.
It's already been painted.
What colour have you got on there then? Just white, is it? Did you say?
It's white.
Yeah. Put if you're going to use that, then put some colour over the top. Yeah. So you've got something to work over. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. This is one that I did like in one of our previous classes. Obviously it's not finished, but you can see how I've applied the colours and the highlights and shadows over the top. I've also then added some skin tones on it, but the black and the white help me to sort of map out those colours first of all with this piece. So it's a case of layering paint on top of each other until you get it to where you want. The nice thing about acrylics is it's quite forgiving in a sense, because if you make a mistake, you can paint over it or move things around or correct it as you go along. This was another one I did without a background on. I did this one a couple of years ago now as well in one of the classes, and you can see where the black and the white is, and then I've applied the colour, skin colours back over the top of it. So the one I'm working on at the moment is this one, just here. So I've worked quite broadly across the face with this, rather than in a small area, although I've started to work in smaller areas with the detail on the eyes here. But you can see how thinly I've put the paint on, and that allows you just to change things as you're working on your portrait. With this one, I sketched it out with a pencil just straight off. I didn't use a grid or trace it or anything like that. So I've just sketched this one out. But if you want to just get straight into it today and you think, right, I just want to get this portrait down on paper and start having a go with the paints when you're ready, then just go for it. Use a grid or trace or apply the graphite onto the back of the paper and then go around the outside of the face to transfer some of the basic shapes to get you going. Okay, because we are kind of focusing on the paint. I actually drew this one out yesterday and then started painting it and adjusting some of the finer details as I've been working along, and I'm going to then start adding texture too. Yes.
Is it better for us to work off? I noticed that all your portraits that you're working off, the black and white ones, is it better for us to pick a black and white image rather than a colour image?
Yeah, it's not exclusive. The reason I've been doing that is because a lot of these tones and shadows are perhaps a bit more obvious in a black and white photograph, and I put black and white photographs on, apart from one maybe, on the website. I've chosen this one because it's got good contrast, but it's also got lots of little textured details and things that we can play around with as we're working. But if you've got a colour picture you really want to do, then just go for it, basically. And one way around that, of course, is to photograph it on your phone and then use a filter to turn it into black and white as well, and then you can look at both colour and black and white to give you an idea, because sometimes colour can be a little bit distracting, you see. So you can get confused between the colours and the tones. So just isolating the tones here helps you just to look at them, particularly bearing in mind we're doing the Grisaille technique, which uses limited almost like mono colours anyway. And these are the colours I've used here, and you can see how grey it's gone. So
just a quick question.
Yeah.
If you haven't got
ultramarine,
marine, what's the next nearest one that would be just as effective?
Good question. We'll have to have a look at that.
Cobalt?
Cobalt would probably, yeah, that's probably a good one actually. Cobalt.
Cobalt.
Yeah, try cobalt. Have you got that? Have you got that?
I don't know. I'll have a hunt.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you.
That's all right. Okay, so we're going to get started with that now. Has anyone got any